If you had asked the people of Red Hollow a year ago what they thought of James Weston, they'd have told you he was a quiet man, too quiet. In fact, the kind of fellow who preferred the company of his fields to the noise of the saloon. He was a farmer, through and through. The sort who woke before dawn and worked until the light was nothing but a dying ember behind the hills. He had shoulders that bore the weight of plow and weather alike, hands leathered by soil and sun, and a face that, while young, seemed older from years of hardship. But all of that changed the morning the rumor began. James Weston was to be married. Now, marriage alone was not news in Red Hollow. People married all the time, out of love, out of convenience, out of that peculiar loneliness that came from living in a town so small you could name everyone in it and their family histories besides. But James's case was different. His wasn't just a marriage. It was two, and not two in sequence, as nature and propriety might allow, but two at once, two sisters. The moment the news left the lips of old Mrs. Haggerty, who ran the bakery, and considered herself the guardian of all town information, it began its journey down Main Street. It whispered through the post office, slithered into the blacksmith's forge, and by the time it reached the general store, it had taken on the shape of an outright scandal. "He's lost his mind," muttered one man by the counter. "No," said another, shaking his head. "He's desperate, and you know what desperation will make a man do." James, of course, knew nothing of the exact moment the gossip was born. He was in his fields that day, knee-deep in the stubborn earth that had been his companion since he was 17. The sun was already fierce, burning off the dew that clung to the young shoots of corn. His shirt clung to his back, and each thrust of the hoe into the ground sent a dull ache up through his arms. But his mind wasn't on the crops. It was on the letter in his pocket. That letter had arrived 2 nights prior, carried by a writer who didn't linger long enough to share a drink. The paper was thick, the handwriting sharp and deliberate, the kind that belonged to a man used to making contracts rather than conversation. In a few short sentences, James's fate had been sealed. His debts were being called in. Every dollar he owed was due in full by the end of the month, or his farm would be taken and sold. For James, the farm wasn't just a piece of land, it was his father's sweat, his mother's laughter echoing in the summer evenings. His own childhood, marked by the rhythm of planting and harvest. Losing it would be like losing a limb. No, worse. It would be losing the part of himself that had kept him anchored when life had tried to wash him away. And life had tried. That's when the second letter came. It was hand-delivered by a man James had never seen before. Tall, thin, dressed too well for the dust of Red Hollow. His hat was spotless, his boots polished, and his eyes, though polite, carried the weight of purpose. James opened the envelope and read an offer that made him read it again. Slower this time. The terms were simple, and yet outrageous. "Marry my daughters, both of them, and in exchange, your debts will be paid. Your farm will remain yours, and you will be granted access to resources you could never have dreamed of." There was no mention of love, no pretense of romance. It was business, as cold and calculated as a ledger. The only human touch in the letter was a brief note at the end. "They are good women. They will treat you well." He had heard of them before. Of course, everyone had. Clara and Beatrice Winthrop, the wealthiest women in 3 counties. Their father, Thomas Winthrop, had made his fortune in railroads and mining, and while most men in his position would have left his daughters in the care of high society suitors, Thomas had chosen to keep them close. Too close, some said. Clara, the elder, was 35, with a warm smile and a fondness for baking that had made her somewhat of a legend at church socials. But she was also formidable in stature. She had never seemed to mind the whispers about her size, though they followed her everywhere. Beatrice, the younger by 3 years, was said to be sharper, quicker to temper, and fiercely protective of her sister. She was, according to town talk, the one who managed the family's accounts and the one you didn't want to cross. James had never spoken more than a few words to either of them. They lived on the far edge of town, in a grand house with tall, iron gates, a place so out of reach it might as well have been in another world. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills that day, the gossip had grown legs. At the saloon, men speculated on how long such a marriage could possibly last. Women traded theories in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward James whenever he passed. No one asked him directly, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of fear that the truth might be stranger than the rumor. James, for his part, didn't bother denying it. What good would it do? The farm needed saving. His pockets were empty, and in a world where power came from either money or the people who had it, marrying into the Winthrop family might be the only way to keep a roof over his head. But even as he convinced himself of the practicality, there was a heaviness in his chest. He had always imagined marriage as something chosen, not bartered. And yet, here he was, standing on the edge of a decision that would bind him to not one stranger, but 2, for life. Somewhere deep down, James suspected that the town's whispers were just the beginning. The morning of the wedding began with the sky so sharp and blue it felt like it had been painted there overnight, the kind of sky that would make an ordinary day seem charmed. But for James Weston, this was no ordinary day. He stood at the edge of the Winthrop estate, his boots sinking slightly into the dew-heavy grass. Staring up at the sprawling mansion, he had never been inside before. The wrought-iron gates, taller than two men, had been flung wide open, an uncharacteristic gesture for a family known for guarding its privacy like a dragon guards gold. Beyond the gates, the drive was lined with lanterns, still burning from the night before, their soft glow waning in the daylight but lending the air a sense of occasion. Servants bustled about with arms full of flowers, trays, linens, a chaotic ballet that spoke of both wealth and last-minute preparations. James shifted from one foot to the other, feeling the tightness of his new suit. It had been tailored hastily by Mr. Weller, the only tailor in Red Hollow, who had stayed up until nearly midnight 2 nights in a row to finish it. The black wool jacket hugged his shoulders too snugly, and the stiff white collar chafed at his neck, making it hard to breathe. He reminded himself that appearances mattered today. This was, after all, not just a wedding, it was the merging of fortunes, the sealing of a bargain, the salvation of his farm. And yet, in spite of all the practical reasons he had told himself, a stubborn voice in the back of his mind kept whispering, "You don't belong here." The Winthrop mansion loomed ahead like something from another world. Its stone walls were draped in ivy, windows gleaming like watchful eyes. The front lawn stretched wide and manicured, dotted with white tents set up for the reception. The scent of roses hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of roasting meats drifting from the kitchens. In the center of the main lawn, rows of wooden chairs faced an archway wrapped in more roses than James had ever seen in one place. It was under that arch he would soon stand with both brides. He hadn't seen Clara or Beatrice since the day the arrangement had been finalized. That meeting had been short, formal, and devoid of the kind of warmth one might hope for in a future spouse. Clara had smiled politely, though her eyes seemed to study him the way a cook might study a cut of meat, appraising, weighing its worth. Beatrice hadn't smiled at all. She'd looked at him with a cool, assessing gaze, and then, almost imperceptibly, nodded. It was clear from the start who held the power in this arrangement. And it wasn't James. The guests began arriving mid-morning, carriages rolling up the drive in a steady procession. James recognized many of the townsfolk, farmers, shopkeepers, tradesmen, their Sunday best, pressed and clean, though most looked around the estate with thinly veiled awe. But there were also strangers, men in fine suits with polished boots, women in silks that shimmered in the sun, their laughter ringing too loud, their jewelry catching the light like tiny flashes of fire. He caught snippets of conversation as they passed. 2 brides at once. Can they even do that here? Money can do anything, dear. I heard the younger ones, the brains of the whole family. Dangerous, that one. James kept his expression neutral, though the words stung. Dangerous or not, Beatrice would soon be his wife, as would Clara. The thought was still absurd to him, no matter how many times he turned it over in his mind. As the clock neared noon, the ceremony began to take shape. A string quartet, hired from the city, set up near the archway, tuning their instruments with crisp, deliberate notes. Servants handed out glasses of chilled wine, and a faint hum of anticipation settled over the gathering like a low, vibrating chord. James's cue came sooner than he expected. One of the Winthrop servants, a wiry man with thinning hair and eyes that darted like a nervous bird, approached and gestured toward the front. "Mr. Weston, sir, if you'll follow me." He was led down the aisle, past rows of watching eyes. Murmurs grew quieter as he passed, replaced by the subtle rustle of fabrics and the occasional click of a shoe shifting on the grass. At the arch, he took his place, the scent of roses so strong it nearly overpowered him. Then the music changed. The crowd rose to their feet, turning toward the mansion. And there they were, Clara and Beatrice Winthrop, descending the grand staircase side by side. Clara wore a gown of cream silk, embroidered with tiny pearls that caught the light with every step. Her veil floated like mist, and her cheeks were flushed to soft pink. Beatrice's dress was simpler, but no less striking, pale blue satin that contrasted sharply with her dark hair, which was pulled back into a sleek knot. Neither wore the giddy, flushed expression of a bride on her wedding day. Their faces were composed, their movements measured. But as they approached, James noticed something else. A glance, quick and almost imperceptible, passed between them. It wasn't nervousness, it wasn't joy, it was something else entirely. The ceremony itself passed in a haze. The officiant spoke words James barely heard. Vows were exchanged, simple, formal, and devoid of romantic flourish. Rings slid onto fingers. Somewhere behind him, a bird called from the hedgerow, the sound oddly clear in the silence that followed. And then it was done. They were husband and wives. The applause that followed was polite, restrained. The Winthrops shook hands with the more prominent guests, posed for photographs, and accepted compliments. James, meanwhile, stood beside his brides, offering smiles that felt stiff and unnatural. He caught Clara's eye once, and she gave him the same polite smile she had at their first meeting. Beatrice didn't smile at all. The reception was lavish, tables laden with roasted meats, fresh breads, fruits from the farthest reaches of the country. Wine flowed freely, and laughter rose from every corner of the lawn. And yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension James couldn't quite name. The sisters spoke to him only when necessary, and when they spoke to each other, it was in low voices, their words lost beneath the music and chatter. It wasn't until much later, as the sun dipped low and the lanterns began to glow again, that James began to understand that this wedding was not the end of something, it was the beginning. And whatever it was, it would be nothing like the life he had imagined when he first stepped onto the Winthrop estate that morning. The sun rose lazily over the Winthrop estate, gilding the rooftops with pale gold and glancing off the dew that clung to every blade of manicured grass. To James Weston, it might as well have been a spotlight. It felt as though the entire estate, every stone and shadow, was watching him, weighing him as he stepped out onto the balcony of the guest suite that had, overnight, become his room. The previous night's wedding festivities had gone on until well past midnight. Lanterns had burned down to their last embers, and the air had been thick with the smells of wine and roast goose. Somewhere in the blur of music, laughter, and handshakes, James had lost track of time. Now, standing barefoot on the cool stone balcony, he tried to recall the exact moment when the celebrations had ended and reality had begun, but the memory was already slipping through his fingers, like sand through an open palm. He glanced down at the sprawling lawn below. Gardeners were already at work, trimming hedges with precision, raking the gravel paths so no footprint from the previous night remained. The Winthrops did not tolerate disorder, even in the wake of a wedding. That much had been made clear to him yesterday, though no one had said it outright. The estate itself seemed to enforce its own rules, its beauty bordering on the oppressive. James ran a hand through his hair and tried to ignore the knot of unease in his gut. Today was supposed to be the first day of his new life. He had expected, well, something different. A warm breakfast with his wives, perhaps, light conversation about plans for the week. Instead, he had awoken to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, not hurried, but deliberate, followed by a sharp knock at his door. When he'd opened it, a maid in a crisp gray uniform had handed him a folded piece of paper without meeting his eye. Mr. Weston, breakfast will be served in the blue dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. Punctuality is expected. The note was unsigned. James turned from the balcony and looked back at the room. It was lavish, almost absurdly so, high ceilings painted with delicate frescoes, a bed large enough to sleep, 4 heavy curtains that fell to the floor like waterfalling velvet. And yet, it didn't feel like his. Nothing about it did. The suit from yesterday's ceremony hung neatly over a chair, already cleaned and pressed. His boots had been polished to a mirror shine, though he hadn't asked for it. Even his shaving kit had been rearranged on the dresser. The brush and razor aligned as if measured with a ruler. At exactly 7:55, James made his way to the blue dining room. The corridors of the mansion were silent except for the faint echo of his own footsteps on the marble floor. Oil paintings of stern-faced Winthrop ancestors lined the walls, their gazes following him in a way that made his skin prickle. When he entered the dining room, Clara was already there. She sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, a porcelain teacup cradled between her hands. She wore a pale green dress, her dark hair pinned neatly back, and she looked as though she had been waiting for some time. "Good morning, James," she said, her tone polite but cool. He nodded. "Morning." Beatrice entered, moments later, her steps silent despite the polished wooden floor. She wore a navy gown and no jewelry except for her wedding ring, which gleamed dully in the morning light. Her expression was unreadable. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Plates of poached eggs, fresh bread, and sliced fruit were set before them by the staff, who moved like ghosts, present but never intrusive. James tried to make conversation. "Lovely gardens you have here," he said, glancing toward the tall windows. "They're maintained daily." Clara replied without looking up from her plate. Beatrice added, "Order is the foundation of this household." It wasn't the warm, welcoming response he'd been hoping for. After a few more attempts at small talk failed, James focused on his food, though even eating felt like part of some unspoken test. The sisters spoke to each other in short, measured exchanges never long enough for James to fully follow, and often punctuated by glances in his direction. When breakfast ended, Clara folded her napkin neatly and set it beside her plate. "You'll meet with Mr. Halloway at 10, she said. "Mr. Halloway, our accountant," Beatrice explained. "There are matters you'll need to be briefed on regarding the estate's finances. You're a part of this family now, James. Certain responsibilities will fall to you." Her tone made it sound less like an invitation and more like a binding contract. The rest of the morning unfolded in much the same way, formal, precise, and oddly impersonal. James met the accountant, who spoke at length about ledgers, investments, and landholdings, most of which James barely understood. He was shown the estate's boundaries by a steward who pointed out each landmark with the proximity of a priest revealing holy relics. By midday, James realized something unsettling. He had not been alone for a single moment since breakfast. Wherever he went, someone was with him, a servant, a steward, a member of the family. It wasn't companionship, it was surveillance. When he finally managed to catch Beatrice alone in the corridor, he tried again to break through the frost. Between them, "I want to understand how things work here," he said. "If I'm to be part of the family," her gaze fixed on him, sharp as cut glass. "You are part of the family," she said. "But understand this, James, you married into the Winthrop name, not the other way around. That means you follow our rules. And if you're wise, you won't try to change them." She left before he could reply. That evening, as the sun set over the estate and the last light bled from the sky, James stood again on the balcony of his room. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear faint laughter, the sisters speaking in low voices behind closed doors. He wondered if they were talking about him. The thought that had been gnawing at him since morning returned, sharper than before. He was no longer his own man. He was part of something far larger and far stranger than he had realized. In whatever role he was meant to play in this new life, it was clear he hadn't been given the full script. The wind carried a faint chill that evening, the kind that slipped under collars and through buttonholes, whispering of rain long before the clouds darkened. James Weston leaned against the heavy oak banister of the Winthrop Estate's grand staircase, watching the play of lamplight on polished marble. The house was quieter than usual, though not in a peaceful way. It was the sort of quiet that hummed beneath the surface, full of things unsaid. Dinner had ended nearly an hour ago, and the sisters had excused themselves without explanation. Clara had risen from her seat, her silverware laid perfectly parallel, her expression unreadable. Beatrice had followed, a fraction of a second behind, but not before giving James a look, brief and sharp, that made the hairs at the back of his neck stand on end. Now the long hallway above him was dark, except for the thin strip of light spilling from one door at the far end, the study, he thought, but as he stood there, something shifted in the air. Footsteps, 2 sets, moving quickly. A door closed. A key turned in a lock. Silence. James found himself climbing the stairs almost without deciding to. His hand slid along the smooth banister, and he placed his feet carefully on the thick carpet to muffle the sound. He told himself it was nothing, perhaps a private conversation, family business he had no place in. Yet something gnawed at him, the same uneasy pull that had followed him since the wedding. He stopped outside the door with the light beneath it. The study, the heavy mahogany door had a brass handle polished to a mirror sheen. He reached out, hesitated, then knocked lightly. No answer. He knocked again. Louder this time, still nothing, but he could hear it now. Voices, low and urgent, like the buzz of bees trapped inside a jar. Clara's voice, clipped and deliberate. Beatrice's, sharper, almost agitated. The words themselves were indistinct, but their tone carried something heavy, something that felt like the edge of a blade. James glanced down the hall. Empty. He turned the handle. Locked. He bent closer to the door, straining to make out even a fragment of the conversation. "Can't risk it." Clara's voice. "Too soon. He'll find out." Beatrice's. A chair scraped against the floor inside. James took a step back, his pulse quickening. For a moment, he thought about retreating, heading back downstairs, pretending he had never heard a thing. But then the lock turned. The door opened only a few inches before Clara appeared in the gap, her eyes cool and steady. "James," she said, her tone carrying no warmth. "Is there something you need?" He tried for a casual smile. "I was just walking past. Thought I'd say good night." Her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat too long. "Good night." Then the door closed again. The lock clicked. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the grain of the wood as though it might reveal the conversation's secrets. Finally, he turned and made his way back down the hall, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves had ears, and that they'd heard more than he had. Back in his room, the air felt thicker, heavier. He paced the carpet, listening to the muffled sounds of the estate settling into night, the faint creak of beams, the whisper of wind through the chimney, the occasional clink of glass from somewhere far away. Every noise seemed sharper, as though the whole house was awake and listening. He thought about the expressions on their faces at dinner, Clara's polite composure, Beatrice's fleeting tension. He thought about the locked door, the urgency in their voices. And most of all, he thought about the words. He'll find out. Who was he? And what was there to find out? The next morning, James rose early. He dressed quietly, determined to catch the sisters before the formalities of the day began. But when he stepped into the hallway, the same maid who had delivered the breakfast note on his first morning was already there, waiting. "Mr. Weston," she said with a small curtsy, "Mrs. Clara and Mrs. Beatrice request that you remain in your room until 10 o'clock. They have business to attend to." James frowned. "Business?" Her gaze flickered to the floor. "Family business, sir." She left before he could ask more. Those hours crawled by, each minute feeding his curiosity. He thought about the estate's layout, the wings he had yet to explore. He had been shown only the gardens, the dining rooms, the main hall, and his quarters. But the Winthrop mansion had other places, entire sections that seemed to vanish into shadows, doors that were always locked, rooms where the curtains never parted. At 10, the maid returned and informed him that the sisters were ready for him to join them in the east drawing room. When he arrived, they were both seated by the tall windows, sunlight spilling across the Persian rug. Clara gestured for him to sit. "We've been reviewing some matters concerning the estate," she began. "Things you may eventually need to know, but for now, it's best that certain details remain with us." Beatrice's gaze was steady, almost challenging. "Trust, James, is built slowly. And in this family, it's earned." He forced a smile. "And how do I earn it?" "That," Clara said, "is what time will reveal." That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished and the corridors lay in shadow, James stood again outside the study. The light beneath the door was gone, but the memory of those muffled voices, "Too soon, he'll find out," burned. In his mind, somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning, and whatever the sisters were hiding, it was big enough to keep behind a locked door. The morning sun poured through the east-facing windows of the Winthrop estate like molten gold, setting the carved oak panels aglow and catching the edges of the heavy damask curtains in a warm halo. James Weston sat at the breakfast table, a place that had become both familiar and alien over the past few weeks. The polished silver reflected his face back at him in distorted gleams, and the faint clink of porcelain cups seemed too loud in the otherwise quiet room. Clara and Beatrice entered together, as they always did, though James had started to notice the differences in their stride. Clara moved with measured precision, each step an exercise in control. Beatrice's gait was a fraction quicker, her movements betraying an energy she could never fully hide. Clara began, settling into her chair with the elegance of a queen taking her throne. "There are matters we need to discuss." The words landed with the weight of a summons. James set down his fork and met her gaze. "I'm listening." Beatrice poured herself tea, the soft splash of liquid into fine china, almost masking the faint sigh she let out. "This marriage," she said, "is unconventional, and there are certain expectations you must understand before you imagine yourself entirely free within it." James felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Expectations." Clara folded her hands. "When our late father arranged the trust that now governs much of this estate, he included provisions, very specific ones, regarding the continuation of the Winthrop line. Your presence here, James, is not merely symbolic, it's practical. You are, in essence, part of a contract." James's mind flicked back to the hurried ceremony, the ink still wet on the marriage license. The quiet but tense celebration that followed. He remembered wondering why there had been no extended family, no close friends. Just the sisters, the officiant, and a silence that seemed to swallow the vows whole. "What kind of contract?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes bright with a mix of amusement and warning. "One in which you will not make decisions without our agreement. One in which certain rooms of this house remain off limits to you. And one in which," she paused, glancing at Clara, "you will trust that what we do with the estate is in everyone's best interest." James studied their faces. Clara's was unreadable, the practiced mask of a woman accustomed to getting her way without ever raising her voice. Beatrice's, though, was more telling, the slightest twitch at the corner of her mouth, as if she were daring him to challenge her. He leaned back in his chair. "You speak as though I have no say at all." Clara's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "On the contrary, you have as much say as our arrangement allows, which, for now, is limited." There was something in the way she said "for now" that lodged itself in his mind. Breakfast ended with the same quiet formality as always, but the weight of the conversation followed James into the rest of the day. He wandered the gardens, the late spring roses blooming in fragrant clusters around stone paths that wound toward the outer wall. The estate was a marvel, lush, sprawling, almost self-contained, but he saw it now, not just as a home, but as a gilded cage. He thought of the locked study door from nights past, the muffled whispers, the abrupt dismissal. He thought of the way the sisters' eyes had flickered toward each other just now, as if confirming something unspoken, and then there were the servants, polite, efficient, but always watchful. He had caught one of the footmen glancing toward him this morning, not with hostility, but with a certain pity. By afternoon, James found himself drawn back inside. He roamed the long corridors, past oil paintings of stern-faced Winthrops whose eyes seemed to follow him. Each room he passed felt heavy with history and secrets. In the west wing, a section he'd rarely visited, he discovered a door left ajar. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the filtered light from a high, narrow window. Inside, stacks of crates lined the walls, each marked with faded shipping labels. The scent of dust and something faintly metallic hung in the air. He stepped inside, curiosity outweighing caution. The nearest crate was half open, its lid askew. Inside, under layers of yellowed cloth, lay silver ingots stamped with dates decades old. Before he could examine further, a voice rang from the doorway. "I see you've found the storeroom." Beatrice stood there, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. James straightened. What is all this? Family holdings, she replied. Part of the estate's reserves. He gestured to the silver. That's a lot of reserves. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and not something you need to concern yourself with yet. The yet hung in the air between them, heavy and deliberate. That evening, the sisters called him to the drawing room. The fire was lit, casting the walls in a warm, flickering glow. Clara poured brandy into 3 glasses, handing one to James. We have decided, she said, that there are parts of the estate you should see, and parts you must never ask about. James took the glass, feeling the heat of the fire at his back. And if I do ask, Clara's gaze was steady. Then you will learn the consequences of breaking trust in this house. Beatrice smiled faintly, but it was not a friendly smile. Trust us, James. The alternative is unpleasant. For the first time, James felt not just curiosity, but genuine unease. Whatever this marriage was, it was no simple union. It was a pact, one built on rules, secrets, and the unshakable sense that the Winthrop sisters held all the keys. And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever truly be free within their world. The storm arrived just after dusk, sweeping down from the northern hills with the kind of suddenness that made the whole town pause. The air, thick and heavy all afternoon, broke open in a cascade of rain that rattled against the tall windows of the Winthrop estate. Lightning lit the distant ridges, and thunder rolled through the valley like the growl of some ancient, restless thing. James Weston stood at the high-arched window of his quarters, watching the downpour turn the manicured gardens into slick ribbons of black and silver. He could see the lamps flickering along the carriage drive, their glow struggling against the wind. Somewhere deep in the house, a grandfather clock struck 8. Its chime, muted by the storm's howl. Tonight was different. He felt it the way a man might sense a predator just out of sight, a subtle tightening in the chest, a quiet that wasn't absence of sound but the presence of something waiting. For weeks, the rules had been the same. Dinners in the East Hall, clipped conversations, carefully limited access to the estate's rooms. But that afternoon, Clara herself had come to his door, her voice even, but her eyes sharp. James, she had said, there are matters we can no longer delay. After supper, come to the West Wing. The locked doors will be opened. She had left, without explaining further, leaving him with a knot of curiosity and apprehension that refused to loosen. The West Wing invitation. By the time James made his way down the main corridor, the storm was in full fury. The candle sconces cast wavering shadows across the polished floor, and the oil paintings of dead Winthrops seemed to shift in the flicker, their eyes following him as he passed. He had only been in the West Wing twice before, both times escorted, and both times warned not to linger. Tonight, there were no guards, no watchful servants, just the faint sound of voices ahead and the scent of burning wood. The drawing room doors were open. Inside, Clara and Beatrice sat by the fire, their figures outlined in the warm glow, but their faces unreadable. A single decanter of amber brandy rested on the low table between them, alongside 3 glasses. You came, Beatrice said, as though there had been any real question. You made it clear I was expected, James replied, stepping inside. Clara gestured to the empty chair across from them. Sit. Tonight, we speak plainly. He sat, the leather cold against his back. Plainly would be a first in this house. That earned him the smallest of smiles from Beatrice, though it held no warmth. The legacy unveiled, Clara poured the brandy, her movements precise. You know by now that our marriage arrangement was not born of romance, she began. It was necessity. But what you do not yet understand is the scale of that necessity, and your place within it. James took the glass, but didn't drink. Then tell me. Beatrice leaned forward. Our family's wealth isn't only in land and silver. It is in agreements, old, binding agreements with families you've never met, and with institutions far more powerful than this town. When our father died, those agreements passed to us. But certain clauses required a male head of household, and there was no such person left. And so you married me, James said flatly. Clara nodded. We needed someone of standing, someone who could fulfill the legal requirement without threatening our control. You were suitable. Suitable, James repeated, the word tasting bitter. And what happens now? Beatrice's gaze flicked toward her sister before returning to him. Now comes the part you were never meant to know. Those agreements, they are not merely about property. They involve debts, very old debts, owed not in coin, but in allegiance. The forbidden rooms. Clara rose from her chair. Come with us. They led him through the West Wing's labyrinth of hallways, past heavy velvet drapes and locked display cases filled with artifacts James didn't recognize. A bronze mask, a ceremonial dagger, a bundle of documents bound with faded ribbon. At the far end, they stopped before a set of double doors carved with a pattern so intricate it seemed to shift when he stared. Too long. Clara produced a key from her bodice. What you see in here does not leave this house. The doors swung open to reveal a room unlike anything else in the estate. It was not a drawing room or study, but a vault, walls lined with shelves, every shelf crammed with ledgers, sealed, boxers, and strange objects under glass. In the center stood a long table, upon which rested an open ledger, its pages filled with names and dates, stretching back nearly 2 centuries. James stepped closer. The first name on the page was Winthrop. The second, Weston, his own surname. The connection. What is this? He demanded. Our families have been bound for generations, Clara said softly. Every marriage, every inheritance, every expansion of land was part of a larger arrangement. Your grandfather broke that chain by marrying outside the pact. We restored it by bringing you here. James's pulse quickened. You mean to say this was decided before I was even born? Beatrice smiled faintly. Long before. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white. For a moment, James thought he saw movement among the shadows, the shape of a man standing in the far corner, but when he turned, there was nothing. The final terms. Clara closed the ledger. Here is the truth. If you leave, the agreements collapse. Land will be lost, alliances broken. Forces far less forgiving than we are will come to collect what's owed. You will not be spared, James, and neither will this town. The words settled over him like a weight. It wasn't just about the sisters' fortune. It was about something much larger, something that reached beyond the estate's gates and into the fabric of the region itself. And if I stay, he asked. Beatrice's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Then you become more than a husband. You become a guardian of a legacy older than both of us, a legacy bound by secrets that cannot be spoken outside these walls. The shock sound interrupted them, a sharp knock from the vault's far side. Clara's head snapped toward it. They're early, she murmured. Before James could ask, the hidden door opened, and 6 figures stepped inside. They were men and women dressed in dark, formal clothes, each wearing a silver pin shaped like the crest carved into the double doors. The eldest among them, a man with hair white as bone, spoke. We have come to witness the binding. James looked from them to the sisters. The what? Clara stepped forward, her voice calm. The final step, tonight. James Weston, you are not merely our husband. You are the new anchor of the pact, bound not by paper, but by oath. Beatrice's smile was slow, deliberate. Once it is done, there is no leaving, ever. And in that moment, with the storm battering the walls and strangers closing in, James understood the full truth. He had never been married for love, or even for money. He had been married into a centuries-old covenant, one that demanded not just his name, but his life.